So, random mutation, natural selection, epigenetic processes, and symbiosis. Let's take the most glamorous one first, epigenetic processes. And this is where it does get complicated straight away, because there are thousands of these tiny chemical reactions taking place on and around the DNA all the time. I think it is important that we get an idea of just how complex this new subject area is, so I'll just read you a short little bit from an article. Histone modifications involve many different amino acids on each histone protein and have very specific functions. Epigenetic modifications can be generated by writer enzymes and removed by eraser enzymes. Specialized reader proteins contain unique domains that specifically recognize these modifications and use them as docking sites. Some epigenetic regulators are required for transcriptional regulation, DNA repair, cell cycle, and differentiation. End quote. And we don't have to understand all of this massively complicated subject area. We're just going to focus on the single aspect of epigenetics which is most relevant for the evolutionary debate. And that is the phenomenon of cell differentiation in the embryo. Ever since we discovered DNA, it's been a bit of a mystery as to how all the different kinds of cells in our body can be so different when they're all encoded by the same DNA. Well, it turns out that the DNA, which is a very long molecule, is sort of wound up on chemical epigenetic spools in such a way that only the relevant genes necessary for the kind of cell that's being built, only those genes are available for expression. And the rest of the DNA is wound up so tightly that nothing can get to it. Then a whole host of epigenetic processes converge on the DNA, and they turn on some genes, they turn off other genes, they connect up suites of genes, they amplify those, they repress those. Sometimes a gene will be turned off in such a way that it can never be turned on again. Sometimes it will be turned off in such a way that it might be turned on again later. Sometimes these processes depend on factors from the environment outside. If it's more light or more acidic, then this or that might happen. If the organism is under stress or has a poor diet or whatever, then this or that might be different. Sometimes these things are achieved by the action of RNA, sometimes by microRNA, sometimes by histone methyltransferases. But the upshot of it is that cell differentiation is an epigenetic process, and that getting anything out of the genes, anything out of DNA, is all regulated and organized by epigenetics. The problem for integrating this knowledge about epigenetics with the standard evolutionary theory is the overarching question of who or what is organizing, coordinating all this complex activity. How does the epigenome know when to apply this protein or that enzyme? And we can step it up a level, because another long-standing mystery in the field of embryology is the fact that if you get a newt embryo at the right stage of development and you cut off the tail and you cut out the leg and you put the tail where the leg was, then that tail turns into a leg. When comes time for those tail cells to reproduce, they don't replicate as tail cells, they replicate as leg cells. And now we know that it's epigenetic processes that have to sort out all that confusion. The question again is, how is it organized? How is it coordinated? The epigeneticists themselves will tell you, we don't know. We just don't know. We can observe all these processes taking place in relation to each other, but why it all happens just as it does, when it does, we just don't know. For the neo-Darwinist, the only possible answer is it's all in the genes. Somehow the DNA itself provides instructions as to how it's to be deployed. There are a couple of problems with this as an explanation though. The first is, as I said, sometimes these epigenetic processes are dependent on environmental factors, some of which might be completely new to an organism. So how could already existing DNA know how to deal with completely new factors? And how could a future random mutation in the DNA come accompanied with a detailed set of instructions as to how this mutation is to be used, deployed, under countless possible situations, again, some of which might be completely new? It just doesn't make sense. And in the case of the transposed tail, well, the DNA is just a molecule. How can it know what has happened up in the lab? Something else is making sense of the DNA. And that seems to be the real problem with integrating epigenetics with the standard evolutionary theory, is who or what is directing all these complicated processes. Next, we'll look at the least glamorous of those four factors, which I think is natural selection. This is not glamorous or particularly interesting because there's very little debate or controversy about natural selection. Everyone understands that all organisms and all mutations are constantly subject to pressure from the environment, whether it's sexual selection or food issues or habitat issues. So if an organism is well adjusted, well adapted, or if the mutation is beneficial, then the organism will do well. If the organism is poorly adapted or the mutation is not so beneficial, then the organism will not fare so well, might even possibly become extinct. Or if the environment itself changes, then that changes the pressures on the organisms within. But in both cases, the role of natural selection is pretty much understood and agreed by all. We'll take symbiosis next. And traditionally, when we think of evolution, we think of the struggle for survival, of natural selection, of competition. The emphasis is always on the fight for survival. So it's taken us a long time to realize that another major factor in evolutionary progress is the way organisms cooperate, the way things work together. Sometimes, in fact, cooperating so intimately that two organisms will combine to form a new one. This is the field of symbiosis, and it's all around us, from the microbes in our tummy that help us digest, to the Hawaiian bobtail squid with his luminescent bacteria, to the glamorous fungi, which symbiose with every plant in the world above 2 meters tall. It's tempting to have a quick look at some of these fascinating individual cases of symbiosis, but again, we have to confine ourselves, focus on the most relevant example of symbiosis for the evolutionary debate. And that is, of course, the symbiosis of the cell nucleus and the mitochondria that forms the basis of the eukaryotic cell, which is pretty much all the cells in all the plants and all the animals that we see in the world around us. This fundamental symbiosis was first recognized by Lynn Margulis in the late 1960s, and it has been a bombshell in the evolutionary debate ever since. The thing about symbiosis is that it's hard to see exactly where you're going to place it in the theory, because if symbiosis is necessary to have any organism bigger than a pin, and more symbiosis is necessary to have any plant above 2 meters tall, and more symbiosis is necessary to have mammals digest grasses, then we start to wonder whether symbiosis might not be the driving force behind evolution, leaving random mutation only at sort of a lower level, marginal role to play with lower level advances and changes. Of course, this is anathema to the neo-Darwinist who wants to maintain the primacy of random mutation, and he would rather see symbiosis relegated to the sidelines, marginal, oh no, it's only bacteria mostly. But as we've seen, some of these symbioses are pretty fundamental. Another problematic aspect of symbiosis for the neo-Darwinist is that it flies in the face of his cherished belief that all evolutionary change is slow and gradual, that species inch their way through the millennia forwards towards new features and new species. Whereas with symbiosis, of course, we see that major changes can happen almost at once. No sooner does the glamorous fungi symbiose with an existing plant, then boom, that plant can grow twice as tall. No sooner do two prokaryotes combine, then boom, multicellular plants and animals are on the way. These are major, major changes that happen all at once. So we can see why it's difficult for the neo-Darwinist to know exactly where to place symbiosis in his theory. So we've looked at epigenetic processes, natural selection and symbiosis. That leaves us with random mutation. And this is, of course, the hardest one to talk about, the most vexed question in the evolutionary debate. And yet it's actually quite simple. It's the most dogmatically held article of faith for the neo-Darwinist that the genetic mutations, which he believes are driving evolution, are random in character. They have no goal, no direction, no aim, no purpose. a mutation occurs because of a copying error perhaps, or microwave radiation from the sun, and whatever change in the phenotype results from this change in the genes is just the luck of the draw. It has nothing to do with the needs of the animal or organism. It's just as it happens, as it works out. This has always been extremely controversial though, and right from the start arguments against it were forcefully extended, but we cannot afford the time to get bogged down in rehashing the whole debate about random mutation. We would be here for days. So I'll just try and summarize it by saying that on the one hand you have people who suggest that nature is so complex and that organisms are so perfectly and often minutely adapted to their environment that it seems like a bit of a stretch to say, well, that was pretty lucky every time. And on the other hand, you have the neo-Darwinists, which is also the scientific establishment, who will say, no, 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 we're talking millions of years here, and over such time spans, even incremental improvements can accrete into significant changes under the influence of natural selection. The first group will then often respond by asking how a random mutation in a gene can result in such complex, often multi-phased instinctive behaviours that are displayed by many birds, animals and insects. And I must admit I never heard a very convincing answer for the neo-Darwinists for that question, but for quite a long time they did have what seemed like a very solid seeming counter-argument for their position. They said mutations pretty much must be random because they can't be anything else. There's no way for anything that an organism does during its lifetime or anything that happens to it out in the real world to make its way down to the level of the DNA to affect the change down there. This was known as the Weissman barrier, named after the biologist who thought it up. And as I say, it was a difficult argument to refute. However, in 1987, and since then replicated and confirmed, it turned out that the physical environment can affect the DNA, namely RNA can come into the DNA from the cytoplasm with information about a virus that's out there, and that information can get taken up into the DNA and then handed down to successive generations. So the Weissman barrier turned out to be a, what should we call it, a theoretical construct rather than an empirical fact. Darwin himself believed in a different mechanism, that of use and disuse. This was a popular idea in his day. Many people had suggested it, including Lamarck. We all know as the giraffe stretches upwards to get the high leaves, his neck grows longer. As the duck paddles around with his feet underwater all the time, his feet get steadily better formed for paddling. And when the mole went underground, he didn't need his eyes any longer, and so he gradually lost them. Even nowadays, this seems like a plausible hypothesis that would explain also other long-standing mysteries in the evolutionary debate. And now we know the Weissman barrier doesn't actually exist, and we also have to admit that we don't really know how the genome and the epigenome work. Who could say for sure whether use and disuse are not factors in evolution? And this is actually approaching the crux of the matter, that despite our vast ignorance and despite the several cogent arguments and objections that can be made to the hypothesis of random mutation, the neo-Darwinist refuses to consider them even for one moment. No, 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 he says, it must be random. All changes must be random. But why must they be random? How can they be so sure? How do we know that random mutation is not like the Weissman barrier, a theoretical construct that turns out not to be true? So this is the end of the first bit of this lecture, which is basically a very short overview of the current state of the evolutionary debate. And for the next bit, I would like to give you a similarly very short overview of the history of science. Then we'll look at the two together. Now, can I just see by show of hands how many people here know what is meant by a paradigm? Most of you, that's good. For those of you that don't know the word, a paradigm is basically a world view, like your intellectual framework, the background picture of the world that you place everything in. if we go back and look at primitive societies, or early societies if you prefer, we see that they nearly all attributed natural phenomena to the work of the gods. And often the natural phenomena were themselves gods. The sun was a god, ocean was a god, mountains was a god, and everything that happened in nature was due to one god or another. So that was their paradigm, their worldview. Then along came the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Greeks said, we're not so sure about these gods. Let's try using our reason to see if we can't elucidate the processes and causes of physical phenomena in the world. And they did pretty well. They realised that the Earth does not rest on anything, it just hangs in space. They realised that the moon has no light of her own, she only reflects light from the sun. This led them to understanding eclipses, and they did pretty well with other celestial phenomena. The Greeks also did really well with mathematics, medicine, philosophy. Eventually, of course, they went downhill. They were replaced by the Romans. The Romans were very practical people, good with their hands, but not really inclined to extend philosophy much. Eventually, the Romans went downhill. We had the Dark Ages, then the Middle Ages, and the Church was back in control, which meant that God was back enabling everything. Then came the Renaissance, which was a reassertion of the ancient Greek values, and men like Francis Bacon and René Descartes started re-emphasizing reason as the way to discover the natural physical processes that underpinned natural phenomena. I often think that William Harvey's discovery in 1628 that the heart works like a pump was a catalyst for this way of thinking, because they saw, look guys, the heart works like a pump, and the pump is a machine. Nature's like a machine. And shortly thereafter we got Newton's laws of planetary motion, which reminded everyone of a celestial clockwork, which would also be a machine. So then it was, look guys, the whole universe is like a machine. And this is how the paradigm of the mechanical universe, the universe being like a machine, emerged, with scientists looking only for physical causes and physical explanations of natural phenomena, and refusing anything that was mystical, supernatural, or religious. Now, I'll just give you a couple of quotes that will illustrate how these guys were thinking in those days. Thomas Hobbes in 1651 put it like this: "For seeing life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within. Why may we not say that all automata have an artificial life? For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body?" Descartes formulated it even more clearly in 1633 when discussing the biology of the mind. He said, "I should like you to consider that these functions, including passion, memory, and imagination, follow from the mere arrangement of the machine's organs, every bit as naturally as the movements of a clock or other automaton follow from the arrangement of its counterweights and wheels." Now, we still see this approach nowadays when biologists talk about serotonin and other neurotransmitters in the brain causing emotional states in the mind. The ultimate formulation of the mechanical universe was famously written by Pierre Laplace in 1814. He said, "We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of the past and the cause of the future. An intellect which at any given moment knew all of the forces that animate nature and the mutual positions of the beings that compose it, if this intellect were vast enough to submit the data to analysis, could condense into a single formula the movement of the greatest bodies of the universe and that of the lightest atom. For such an intellect, nothing could be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes." This paradigm of a mechanical universe has several characteristics, but today we are only going to look at two of them. Firstly, it's a reductionist model of the universe, and secondly, it's a non-teleological model. Teleological is a technical term of philosophy that means goal-directed. So non-teleological means no goal, no aim, no purpose, which is pretty much what we would expect from a machine. And by reductionist we mean a model or an approach where we can explain any complex phenomenon by breaking it down into its parts and then looking at them, then breaking them down into their parts and looking at them. and so on, until we get down to the level of the atom, which is generally as far as we can sensibly go. Over the past 5 centuries, this approach has led to enormous successes with modern chemistry, medicine, electricity, cars, televisions, aeroplanes, refrigerators, atom bombs, and rockets to the moon. So we can see how important it was for scientists to frame a theory of evolution that would fit in with this dominant and successful paradigm. And that is, of course, what neo-Darwinism is. It's reductionist because it explains or it reduces the physiological manifestation of an organism, reduces that down to the molecular level of the DNA, and it's non-teleological because it insists that all changes are without a goal, are random. So now we see why the neo-Darwinist has to insist that all changes are random, because he's trying to fit in with the paradigm of the mechanical universe that informs all the rest of science. And reciprocally, this also explains why the doctrine of random mutation has received the endorsement and support of the scientific establishment, despite its being intrinsically unlikely and despite the various cogent objections that can be made to it. It's because it embodies these aspects of non-teleology and reductionism that are so important to the wider community. And so we can also see why it's been so hard to get any movement in the evolutionary debate. It's because we're not just talking about issues involved in evolution, we find ourselves coming into conflict with these fundamental assumptions that underpin the whole framework of modern science. Now, I'd like to go back and have another quick look at a couple of the things we were talking about before. Look at symbiosis first. Let's just take a minute to consider the example I mentioned before of the Hawaiian bobtail squid. He feeds at night near the surface of the water, so he is outlined against the night sky for any predators coming up from beneath. So he's developed a lining of luminescent bacteria on his tummy that give off just the right amount of light so that he blends in with the night sky above. He's also got sensors on his back so that if the night sky gets darker or lighter, if the moon goes behind a cloud or whatever, he senses this and then he can adjust how brightly his bacteria are shining underneath, which is just amazing, right? Or consider the bull ants living in their acacia trees, bees with orchids, coral and algae. In our own human bodies, there are over 500 different kinds of bacteria with which we all have full symbiotic relationships. Everywhere we look in the world, every organism, every ecosystem is shot through with symbiosis. And what can we conclude from that? Well, I think it's fair enough to say that it seems there is a tendency in nature for these sorts of relationships to occur. And where you have a tendency, you have a direction. And where you have a direction, you're starting to talk about teleology. And the direction of symbiosis is obviously towards a higher level of complexity, of organisation. Every time two organisms come together and form a symbiotic relationship, we've increased the complexity, increased the level of organisation in the world. And so in this way, evolution does not conform to the non-teleological model of the mechanical universe. Now, it might seem a bit vague, a bit nebulous to say that a tendency towards increasing complexity proves that nature has a teleological aspect. But right next door, over in epigenetic processes, we see some much more concrete examples of teleology in action, both generally in that all epigenetic activity seems directed towards the goal of healthy and optimal maintenance of the DNA, and specifically in the case of the transposed tail, where we can see that the end goal of a healthy fetus is somehow informing the epigenetic processes. This all goes to confirm that the paradigm of the mechanical universe does not apply to living systems. Now, I'd just like to wind up by calling your attention to a couple of aspects of epigenetic processes with regard to random mutation. One is that there are whole branches of epigenetic processes whose sole sole purpose seems to be the rectification of copying errors made during DNA replication. So it seems unlikely that copying errors can be contributing significantly to evolutionary progress. And as for the other sorts of mutation, any other sorts, whether due to microwave radiation from the sun or whatever, they may well occur and they may well be random, but they will still be subject to the same kinds of purposeful application that characterize all epigenetic processes. Just like in the past, when DNA expanded by absorbing viruses, you can say the meeting between the DNA and the virus was accidental, but the epigenetic processes still had to decide where and how to fold the virus into the DNA, and then the epigenetic processes had to assess the genes that the virus had on offer, and then decide how to link up and coordinate those genes with the genes already in the DNA, and generally how to implement the genes from the virus in the service of the DNA. And it's this purposeful application on the part of epigenetic processes that is driving evolution forward, not the virus or the mutation as such. So at this point, I feel justified in going back to our blackboard and putting a question mark behind random mutation and putting it in parentheses and bringing it down behind epigenetic processes to indicate that whatever role is played by random mutation, it is subsumed under, organized, directed and coordinated by the same sorts of epigenetic processes that organize everything else to do with the DNA. Now this leaves us a space at the top line here, and I think the only thing to do is to go back to Darwin and write in use and disuse as a factor to be considered. As I say, we don't know how the epigenome works. We know that the Weissman barrier does not exist the way we thought it did. We also know that from our own experience, if you practice something, you get better at it. Perhaps this could also apply to species as well as to individuals. So that would leave us with use and disuse, natural selection, epigenetic processes, including random mutation, and symbiosis. And I think you'll find that those four factors work together in a much more natural, harmonious and convincing way than the first four we had up there, which could never be reconciled. I realise this has been a bit of a whirlwind tour, but I hope I've provided enough of a platform on which to base future discussion. And at the very least, I hope that if you are talking about evolution with someone and they say, ah yes, evolution, random mutation and natural selection, don't you know? That you will just smile calmly and say, I think we've discovered there's a bit more to it than that. Thank you.